Hello and welcome to another edition of Whiskey Sunday's News Break. I'm your host, Derek Carey. Stephen Roach, one of the world's leading authorities on Asia, is worried a changing global landscape paired with a massive U.S. budget deficit will spark a dollar crash. The U.S. economy has been afflicted with some significant macro imbalances for a long time, namely a very low domestic savings rate and a chronic current account deficit. His forecast calls for a 35% drop against other major currencies. We'll play the soundbite from Bloomberg Market with Stephen Roach as he explains how a coming crash in the US dollar will unfold.
Let's look at a morning must-read off his important essay on the collapse of the U.S. dollar. America's savings current account problems are about to come into play with a vengeance. The rest of the world is starting to look less bad. A weaker dollar, it would boost U.S. competitiveness, but only for a while. Notwithstanding the hubris of American exceptionalism, no leading nation has ever devalued its way to sustain prosperity. Stephen Roach, could it be that big of a dollar move where we move from depreciation to a consideration of devaluation?
Well, Tom, I mean, the problem with the U.S. and its saving current account imbalances is that they were already setting us up for a problem before the pandemic hit. The net national savings rate, which is the broadest measure of domestic saving, it's the savings of businesses, households, and the government sector adjusted for depreciation, was at 1.4% of national income in the first quarter of 2020. And the average, 45-year average from 1960 to 2005 was 7. So we were at the lower end of an acceptable bound. And then, we have introduced this massive relief package, which is going to blow our budget deficits higher than we've ever seen and take debt to GDP ratios well above those which were evident in the end of World War II. So I look at that and I say, okay, with deficits up, with debt up, with savings likely to go sharply into negative territory, which is going to be even worse than it was during the global financial crisis, the current account is probably going to exceed its prior record of minus 6.3% of GDP in 2005, and currencies are designed to cushion the blow of an exploding current account in the context of weak domestic savings. So I think a dollar decline is inevitable.
What you're hearing here, folks, is textbook Stephen Roach. I mean, this is why the guy became acclaimed at Morgan Stanley. Stephen, our audience may not be able to articulate net national savings, but they know a free lunch when they see it. When do we actually pay for this debt buildup?
Well, right now, of course, nobody worries about deficits and debt because interest rates are close to zero. And so the cost of servicing the debt, the interest payments that the U.S. Treasury has to make are de minimis. But, the question is, Tom, can we count on interest rates to stay at zero in perpetuity? And that comes back to things like inflation and relative risk premia. And in a weaker dollar environment where the U.S. has also been backing away from its commitment to globalization through all of these very protectionist and nationalistic policies of the current administration, the willingness of the world to fund the budget deficits of a saving short U.S. economy gets drawn into question, and that has interest rate implications. So the idea that there's no consequences for deficits and debt, I think, is absolutely absurd. Near term, there's no immediate debt service cost, but come on, we can do a better way of assessing long-term consequences than looking at short-term interest rate expenses over the next few quarters.
Stephen, how difficult also is it to understand the impact that COVID-19 and others, and frankly just foreign policy, has on global supply chains? And given what you've just said about debt and supply chains, are we going to see a more deflationary pressure, or do you worry that 18 months from now we'll talk about inflation in America?
No, I actually think the supply chain question is a very meaningful one. There's clearly evident, for instance, during this pandemic, concerns over supply chain security with respect to medical supplies, and even in the case of the U.S., supply chain security with respect to domestic food supplies, to say nothing of the great toilet paper syndrome. But we believe, and this was articulated by a pathetic editorial written in the New York Times several weeks ago by U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, that all we got to do is just move from offshoring to reshoring, bring the jobs back home, and America will be fine again. Well, what Mr. Lighthizer, who's a lawyer who knows nothing about economics, doesn't realize is that with reshoring comes moving production back to higher cost domestic platforms, which is inflationary for the U.S. and is the functional equivalent of a tax hike on American consumers. You don't just push a button and end supply chains. And the research shows, by the way, that not only the supply chains important in holding down global inflation, but they're very sticky. They take years and years to assemble, and you just don't transform them overnight.
Well, that concludes this edition of Whiskey Sunday's Newsbreak. I hope you enjoyed the show. For more information, visit us at teamdoubleedge.com and join us on social media for content updates.